I said I lost my mind when I retired. My daughter said it, my neighbors said it, and honestly, after 32 years running a fraud investigation unit for the IRS, maybe I had earned the right to be a little unpredictable. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 67 years old. I live alone in a 2-bedroom house in Knoxville, Tennessee, and last spring I did something that most people would call insane. My son-in-law called it illegal. My daughter called it the bravest thing anyone had ever done for her. I am going to let you decide. My daughter. I will call her my daughter because that is who she is to me, the most important person in my world since her mother passed 8 years ago. She married him 4 years ago. I was not at the wedding. Not because I was not invited. I was there, standing in the third row of St. Michael's Episcopal on a Tuesday afternoon in June, watching her walk down the aisle toward a man I had spent 6 months quietly researching. Old habits. His name was Damon. Damon Reeves. He was 39 when they married, 12 years older than my daughter, and he had a smile that never quite reached his eyes. I noticed that at their first dinner together. I notice things. It is what I did for 3 decades. I sat across tables from people who were lying, and I watched their faces, and eventually the truth came out whether they wanted it to or not. Damon was charming in the way that men who have practiced being charming are charming. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. He laughed at the right moments, but he never asked about my daughter's childhood. He never asked what she was like before he met her. Men who are genuinely interested in a woman want to know the version of her that existed before they arrived. Damon only seemed interested in the version he was building. I did not say any of this to my daughter. She was 31 and luminous and happy in a way I had not seen since before her mother got sick, and I decided that love sometimes means staying quiet and staying watchful. I watched for 3 years. The first sign was small. My daughter stopped calling on Sundays. We had talked every Sunday since she left for college in 2005. It was our thing, our standing appointment, her voice on the other end of the line telling me about her week. Then it just stopped. When I asked her about it, she said she had been busy. When I pressed, she said Damon liked to keep Sundays for them as a couple, and she thought that was healthy. I thought a lot of things. I kept them to myself. The second sign came at Thanksgiving. I drove up to their house in Charlotte. They had a nice house, a new construction in a quiet neighborhood, the kind with a homeowners association and matching mailboxes. And when I arrived, my daughter met me at the door before I could ring the bell. She was thinner than I remembered. Her hair was different. And when I hugged her, she held on 2 seconds longer than usual. Over dinner, Damon corrected her 3 times. Once when she told a story about a trip they had taken and got a detail wrong. Once when she laughed too loudly at something I said. Once when she started to tell me about a job opportunity she had been considering, and he reached over and put his hand on her arm and said, very quietly, that they had already talked about that. She stopped talking about it. I watched her face when he did that. She went smooth and careful the way a person goes when they have learned that certain expressions cost them something. I drove home that night instead of staying over like I had planned. I sat in my kitchen at midnight drinking decaf and thinking about all the things I knew about men like Damon Reeves and all the things I did not yet know. There was my former colleague, a woman named Sherry who had worked financial crimes with me for 15 years, who finally said the thing I had been thinking. She came over for dinner in February, and I showed her the photos I had taken at Thanksgiving on my phone, and she looked at them for a long time without saying anything. You know what that is, she said. I know what it looks like, I said. It is the same thing, she said. I started paying closer attention after that. My daughter and I still talked, but less frequently and always when she called me rather than when I called her. And I noticed that the calls were always short and always in the middle of the day and never in the evening. I noticed that she had stopped posting on social media. I noticed that when I sent her an article about a pottery class being offered at the community center near her neighborhood, something she had mentioned wanting to try, she wrote back, "That sounds fun. I'll ask Damon." She used to do things without asking anyone. In March, she called me on a Wednesday at 2:14 in the afternoon, and she was crying. Not loud crying. The quiet kind, the kind where you can tell the person is trying to make sure no one hears them. She said everything was fine. She said she was just tired. She said she was just tired. She said she was just tired. I asked her very carefully if she was safe. She paused for 3 full seconds, I counted, and then she said of course she was, and she had to go, and she would talk to me soon. I booked a flight to Charlotte the next morning. I did not tell her I was coming. I told myself it was because I did not want her to worry. Did not want to make a big thing out of nothing. Did not want to be the overprotective father who could not let his daughter live her own life. But the truth is, I had been in this business long enough to know that when you telegraph a move to someone who is being watched, the person watching them finds out. I landed at noon on a Thursday and rented a car and sat in a parking lot down the street from their house for 2 hours. I felt ridiculous. I am 67 years old and a retired federal investigator, and I was sitting in a Hyundai Elantra with a gas station coffee, watching a beige house in a suburban cul-de-sac like I was on a stakeout in 1998. Then Damon's truck pulled into the driveway and he got out, and I watched him walk to the front door. And something about the way he moved, something tight and purposeful, like a man who had already decided how a conversation was going to go, made my chest go cold. I waited 20 minutes. Then I walked up to the front door and knocked. My daughter answered. She was wearing a long-sleeve shirt on a 60-degree afternoon, and before she could say a single word, I could see in her eyes the thing I had been afraid of seeing for 3 years. It was not fear exactly. It was the look of someone who had learned to make themselves very small. "Dad," she said, "what do you?" "I was in the neighborhood," I said. "Old friend from the Charlotte field office. Thought I'd stop by." She let me in. Damon was in the kitchen. He came out with his hands in his pockets and that smile that did not reach his eyes, and he shook my hand and said, "What a surprise. What a great surprise," and offered me a beer. We sat in their living room and talked about nothing for 40 minutes. I am good at talking about nothing. I spent 3 decades doing it. And while I talked, I watched, the way I always watch, and I catalogued. The way she looked at him before she spoke, checking, always checking. The way she laughed only after he laughed. The way she sat angled slightly away from him. The body language of a person who has learned to be ready to move. When I used the restroom, I walked slowly down the hallway. There was a door on the left that was cracked open, a home office. I paused just long enough to see what was on the desk. A laptop, some papers, and in the corner, a safe, the kind you bolt to the floor. In my years at the IRS, I learned that control over money is almost always the first form of control. It is invisible, it is deniable, and it is devastatingly effective. I stayed another hour and then said my goodbyes. In the driveway, my daughter walked me to my rental car while Damon stood in the doorway. She hugged me and I hugged her back, and she whispered so quietly I almost missed it. "I'm okay, Dad. I'm handling it." Handling it. Not there's nothing to handle. Not you worry too much. Handling it. I drove to my hotel and I sat on the edge of the bed and I thought about what I was going to do. Here is the thing about being a retired fraud investigator. You spend your whole career working within systems, warrants and subpoenas and proper channels and chain of evidence. You do it right or you do it not at all, because that is the only way it sticks. And for 32 years, that was my religion. But there are no warrants for what happens behind closed doors in a marriage. There are no subpoenas for the slow daily theft of a person's confidence. The system I had served my whole life was not built for this particular crime. So I called Sherry. "Tell me what you need," she said. "A plan," I said, "a real one. What I am about to tell you is not something I advise anyone to do. But I am also not going to apologize for it." Sherry had retired 6 months before me and had spent the intervening time doing consulting work for a non-profit that helps domestic abuse survivors navigate financial recovery. She knew things. Specifically, she knew how to find things, account structures, hidden assets, financial patterns, using only publicly available records and a very particular kind of patience. Over the next 3 weeks, working from my kitchen table in Knoxville, we built a picture. Damon Reeves was not who he said he was. He had presented himself to my daughter as a successful commercial real estate consultant. In reality, His income was inconsistent, his business filings were a maze, and he had quietly moved most of the household finances into accounts that only he controlled approximately 8 months into their marriage. My daughter's paycheck, she worked as a hospital billing coordinator, was deposited into a joint account that Damon managed, from which she received a monthly allowance that he had set at $900. $900 a month, for a grown woman, for my daughter. There was more. He had taken a second mortgage on the house without her knowledge, using a financial power of attorney she had signed early in the marriage that she told me later she thought was just paperwork for their taxes. He had opened 3 credit cards in both their names. The balances totaled just under $40,000. When I laid it all out on a legal pad and looked at it in the aggregate, I felt something that in 32 years of looking at financial crimes I had rarely felt. Not just anger. Something older and quieter than anger. Something that lived in the place where a father keeps the things he cannot file a report about. I called my daughter and told her I needed her to meet me. Alone. Not at the house. She came to a Panera Bread near her office on a Tuesday during her lunch break. She sat across from me with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and I slid the legal pad across the table and watched her face as she read. She did not cry. She went very still, the way people go still when something they already knew is confirmed. "How long have you known?" I asked. "About the accounts, maybe a year," she said. About everything else, she shook her head. I kept thinking I was wrong. I kept thinking I was being dramatic. I have interviewed hundreds of people. I know when someone is telling the truth. My daughter had been telling herself she was dramatic for 3 years while a man methodically dismantled her life. "What do you want to do?" I asked. She looked at me across the formica table, and for a moment she looked exactly like she did at 7 years old, sitting in my truck after falling off her bike, before she decided she was not going to cry. "I want out," she said, "but I don't know how. He controls everything. He knows everyone we know. And She stopped. "He's told me things. About what happens if I try to leave." I kept my face very still. "What kind of things?" She told me. The specifics do not need to be repeated here. What I will tell you is that they were the kind of things that a man says when he has calculated very carefully exactly what will be most effective. Damon Reeves was intelligent. That was the most dangerous thing about him. "Give me 3 weeks, I said. "Dad, 3 weeks? Then you're done with him." "I promise." I had made my daughter very few promises in 67 years. The ones I made, I kept. The plan required 3 things. First, a lawyer. Specifically, a family law attorney in Charlotte named Val, who Sherry knew from her non-profit work and who had a reputation for being extraordinarily good at rapid protective orders and emergency asset freezes. Second, documentation, the kind that would survive a courtroom. Third, access. Access was the problem. Damon had put a passcode on the home office. My daughter did not know it. He had told her the office was for work and the confidentiality of his clients required privacy, which, she said, had seemed reasonable to her at the time. I asked her one question: "Does he ever leave the house alone?" "He went to the gym every Tuesday and Thursday morning. 45 minutes, sometimes an hour. She was always home. He insisted on that. But he was gone." I told my daughter to send me a picture of the lock on the office door. It was a standard push-buttoned privacy lock, the kind you find on interior doors in residential construction. The kind that opens with a flathead screwdriver inserted into the slot on the outside knob. I want to be careful here. I am not going to tell anyone how to enter a space they are not permitted to enter. What I am going to say is that my daughter lived in that house, and that house was legally her residence, and that on a Thursday morning in late April I drove to Charlotte in my own car, parked 2 blocks away, and at 7:23 a.m. my daughter let me in through the back door. I had 40 minutes. The safe was a problem I had anticipated, but the laptop was open and logged in because Damon had left in a hurry that morning. My daughter had mentioned casually the night before that she was worried about a strange charge on a credit card, and he had been distracted since then. and I had brought a portable drive and Sherry on the phone, and in 31 minutes we had what we needed. Bank statements, correspondence, a folder labeled with an almost impressive lack of imagination. Personal. In that folder were communications between Damon and his brother, who lived in Raleigh, discussing in considerable detail the process by which Damon planned to acquire full financial control of my daughter's assets in the event of a divorce, which he had apparently been planning for approximately 14 months, and then initiate the divorce himself once the transfer was complete. He had been planning to leave her. After taking everything, he had timed it out. I sat in my daughter's kitchen for 1 minute after I read that. 1 minute, looking at the wall. Then I put the drive in my jacket pocket and I walked out the back door. 2 days later, Attorney Val filed for an emergency protective order and an asset freeze. She had everything she needed. The motion cited financial abuse, coercive control, and newly discovered evidence of fraudulent asset transfer, which, as it turns out, is a civil matter, a criminal matter, and in North Carolina specifically, the basis for something called an innocent spouse claim that can substantially limit a victim's liability for debts incurred through deception. Damon was served on a Friday afternoon. My daughter told me later that she had been in the kitchen when the sheriff's deputy knocked on the door, and that she had watched Damon's face when he read the paperwork, and that it was the first time in 4 years she had seen him look like something had happened to him that he had not planned for. She said she excused herself to go upstairs. She said she sat on the edge of the bathtub and she breathed, for the first time in a long time, like someone who was not waiting for something bad to happen. I was in the parking lot of a Cracker Barrel 40 minutes away when she texted me. 3 words. It's done, Dad. The legal proceedings took 8 months. I'm not going to walk through all of it. Attorneys earned their fees and the courts did their work, but I will tell you the material facts. The emergency asset freeze held. Damon's access to the joint accounts was suspended within 72 hours. Attorney Val filed a discovery motion that required him to produce 5 years of financial records, and when the full picture emerged in deposition, his attorney's expression told you everything you needed to know about what it looked like. The second mortgage on the house, taken without my daughter's meaningful consent, was invalidated. The credit card debt was apportioned by a judge who read the documentation carefully and was not particularly sympathetic to Damon's explanation. My daughter was awarded the house, which she promptly sold, and a settlement that accounted for the years of financial control. Damon's business, such as it was, did not survive the scrutiny. 3 of his former clients filed complaints with the state licensing board within weeks of the deposition becoming a matter of record. The last I heard, he had moved back to his mother's house in Greensboro. My daughter lives in a 2-bedroom apartment in Asheville now. She takes a pottery class on Tuesday evenings. She calls me on Sundays again. Last month she came down to Knoxville and we sat on my back porch and drank iced tea and watched the evening come down over the ridge. And she was quiet for a long time. And then she said, "You know what I think about sometimes?" "What?" "I think about all the years I spent making myself smaller, trying to take up less space, and I think," she shook her head, "I wasted so much time." I set my glass down. "You were surviving," I said. "That's not waste, that's work." She looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded, and we sat there a while longer without saying anything, which is the particular comfort of people who have been through something together and do not need to keep talking about it. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years chasing financial crimes through bureaucratic systems and legal frameworks, and most of the time justice was slow and partial and exhausting. The system is imperfect. Evidence goes missing, memories shift, lawyers find angles, and the people who were harmed are often the ones left carrying the weight. But sometimes, not always, not even often, everything lines up, the right information, the right people, the right moment, and you find yourself sitting in a rented car in a suburban parking lot at 67 years old, with a portable hard drive in your jacket pocket and a retired colleague on the phone thinking, "I have spent my entire life learning exactly this. People said I was reckless. Maybe I was. I would do it again before I finished the thought." I keep thinking about that drive home from Thanksgiving. Midnight, empty highway, cold coffee in the cup holder. I did not have a plan yet. I only had that image of my daughter going smooth and careful at the dinner table. The way her face arranged itself the moment he reached over and touched her arm. I have seen that face on other people. Hundreds of them over 32 years. People sitting across from me in federal interview rooms, people who had been defrauded or coerced or slowly maneuvered out of everything they owned. There is a particular stillness that settles over someone who has learned that reacting costs them something. You do not forget it once you have seen it enough times. And you never ever want to see it on your own child. What Damon did was not a crime of passion. That is the thing people do not understand about this kind of harm. There was nothing hot or impulsive about it. He had spreadsheets. He had a timeline. He had calculated, with genuine patience and intelligence, exactly how to take apart another person's life from the inside, while she thanked him for the life they were building together. That is a different category of wrong. It is cold and deliberate, and it requires, at its core, a complete indifference to the humanity of another person. And here is what I have come to believe about that kind of wrong. It cannot survive exposure to someone who is both willing to look at it clearly and capable of doing something about it. The capable part matters. I was lucky. I had spent 3 decades learning how financial control works, how documentation survives a courtroom, how to build a case that holds. Most fathers do not have that. Most people who love someone in that situation have the willingness but not the tools, and that gap between wanting to help and knowing how is where a lot of harm continues far longer than it should. But the willing part matters more. Because capability without the moral clarity to use it is just expertise sitting on a shelf. I knew what I was looking at when I saw my daughter's face at that dinner table, and I made a choice, not a reckless one, a deliberate one. That I was not going to look away from it and tell myself it was not my business. That is the thing I want to say most plainly, not as a lesson exactly. More as something I figured out by doing it. The people who cause the most damage in quiet, domestic ways are counting on the people around them to stay in their lane, to not ask too many questions, to respect the privacy of the household, to assume it will work itself out. Damon had built his entire operation on that assumption, and he had been right about it for 4 years. He was wrong about me. My daughter takes pottery on Tuesday evenings now. She told me last month that she made a bowl that came out lopsided and she kept it anyway, put it on her kitchen windowsill. She said there is something she likes about it, the evidence that she made it herself, that her hands shaped it, that it is hers in a way nothing gets to be hers unless she made it. I understood exactly what she meant. The strength it takes to survive something like what she survived is not loud. It does not announce itself. It looks like a woman in a long-sleeve shirt on a 60-degree afternoon holding on 2 seconds too long when her father hugs her, quietly deciding that she is handling it. That kind of endurance is real and it deserves to be named. But endurance alone is not enough. It keeps you alive. It does not get you out. What gets you out is someone who sees you clearly, thinks carefully, and refuses to be convenient. I am 67 years old. That is the only wisdom I have that is worth anything.